Brian, why 5 out of 5? Why Holacracy 5 out of 5? First reason being that you were there in a well, physically present among us 5 years ago in Paris. Remember, you were fronting approximately 100 people listening to you, and that was 5 years ago exactly. And that was also 5 years ago that the last upgrade took place, more or less, namely the version 4.1. And this is our 5 years anniversary of this Holacracy meetup, Paris. And we have 5 chapters in this V5 version, as well as the previous one, but they're totally differently organized. You'll tell us a word about it in a second. And also we did that because this is our 25th anniversary, 25th edition of this Holacracy meetup. And we haven't listened to you yet, but I guess we'll be not only hearing you, but understanding you, because you'll be speaking, French, understandably English. You'll be speaking slowly for us, and we'll be listening to you 5 out of 5. Brian, this is your time. My question for you is a fundamental one, so to speak. What tensions, those differences between the situation as it is and the way you'd like it to be, what tensions did trigger the coming of the V5 version, and how did you solve them?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I love the frame of what tensions led to this, because to me, that's one of the things that's different about the development of Holacracy from many things already. It's tension driven. It's not, this doesn't come from theory. It doesn't come from somebody's good ideas. It comes from noticing what's not working as well as it could in practice, right? Where are we seeing friction? Where is something just harder than it should be? Or where's there an opportunity? Where are the rules not capturing all the value they could, right? And it's by hundreds of companies doing Holacracy every day and feeding back what they're noticing to us, and coaches like you guys and us doing this with clients, noticing where are we having trouble? Where are the rules harder to absorb than it could be? And from that, we have an open source development process, a lot like any open source software, where anyone using it can submit tensions or issues and say, here's what I'm noticing. And that drives the development. That drives the evolution of the Constitution.
We need to turn some mic off. Vincent, if you could turn your mic off, that would help. Sorry, Brian.
It's done.
No, that's fine. Yeah, so it's the exact same thing Holacracy does inside a company, right? The beauty to me of Holacracy, one of the beauties, is it helps a company become evolutionary, right? It helps a company stop applying top-down designs from mind. Stop trying to design from an intelligent design standpoint, and instead adopt an evolutionary process whereby design is the emergent result of everyone in the organization doing work consciously, noticing what could be better, and feeding that back into the design process. Right? It's to me, Holacracy brings in the difference between intelligent upfront design and evolutionary design. And evolutionary design tends to be better for any kind of complex system. And I think that same thing applies to the design of Holacracy itself, right? The more we can design Holacracy through an evolutionary design algorithm, the better. And to do that, we need to get out of our good ideas and into listening to reality. And in fact, when I look at the changes in version 5, and this is true for every one of the versions we've released in 15 years, what I notice is often the things that were in there because they were somebody's good idea are more often than not the things that are causing trouble. It's fascinating to see. Each version tends to remove rules or change rules that were less grounded in real experience and more, oh, that really came because somebody thought it was going to be a good idea, right? And of course, you can't completely turn off that kind of design. It happens, it slips in. Sometimes I didn't even realize it until I listened to the tensions and realized, oh, this rule, where did that rule come from? Oh, we didn't actually have any good cases for that rule. It just seemed like a good idea and it snuck in. So a lot of it is discovering the rules that we kind of put in place from theory and realizing that in practice, they need to be different. So I've got just a few slides just to kind of frame some of the changes. And I'll talk about the tensions that led to each. So I'm going to share my screen for that. And that said, I want to add that there are hundreds of changes in this version. And I'm going to highlight just a few. So there's far more than what you're seeing, but I want to at least talk about some of the major ones here. Not even all of the major ones, but at least some of them with the time we have.
If you tell us about the 5 big changes, we'll be happy.
Yes, exactly. Let me share my screen. Here we go. Okay, you should be seeing, did that work? Are you seeing my slide deck?
Excellent.
Yeah, okay, good. So let's talk about them. The first one, it's just easier to read and understand. The last version was not. The last version, well, okay, the last version was easier than the one before, but nowhere near where this one is. And one of the tensions we heard a lot is Holacracy is really hard to learn. And one of the reasons it's hard to learn is the rules themselves at times were really hard to understand. They were complex, especially in written form. And that's one of the beauties of Holacracy is it's a written down rule system. So everyone can be on the same page and have equal access to the rules of the game, right? We have a constitution that has the written rules of Holacracy. The problem is that constitution in our last version, in version 4.1, that constitution was longer than it needed to be. The new version has 20% less words, right? So 20% less words to cover more rules, actually, because there are new rules in this version. So it's a lot less wordy, but there's actually more sentences in it. And if you think about what that means, is it means you have much shorter sentences. And it's just so much easier to understand as a result. We've broken it up into just short, easy to understand little sentences so that you don't have to wrap your head around what seems like a legal document in order to understand the rules of the game. Right? Think about any board game that you might play that has a rule book. Hopefully, if the game's easy to learn and easy to understand, the rule book doesn't read like a giant legal contract. It reads like a pretty simple description, a human readable description of the rules of the game. And that's really the difference between the last version and this version. The last version was not, it did read like a big legal contract, much more so. This version reads much more like the rule book of a good game. It's simple, short, and to the point. And because of that, the reading comprehension level is lower. So there are tools online, rather interesting tools, you can copy and paste text into, and it will analyze it and tell you what grade level, what level of education that writing is kind of at or whatever. And the difference between the last version and this version went from late college, it was like graduate level reading comprehension level, down to early high school, right? So vastly simpler to read. You no longer need an advanced degree to understand the rules of Holacracy from reading them. I used to tell people with the last version, I'd tell people don't read the rule book. It's not the way to learn this game. You learn by playing. And I still stand by that. The best way to learn this game is still not to read the rule book. I don't think it is for any sport, any practice, any game. You don't learn about soccer by reading the FIFA rules of soccer. You learn it by going and playing, and that's still true. But in the prior version, you had no chance of learning much at all from the rules until you had played the game. Whereas now you can actually get some clarity from the rule book. Just again, like a good game, I'd rather learn a game by playing with some friends who had already played the game. But if I can't, I'll pick up the rule book and I'll learn something that way. And it might be a little slower, but I'll figure it out. And that's now true with Holacracy as well. So vastly simplified. So that's kind of one major change. And that goes with it. It's not just easier to read from the construction of language. That's true. But it's also because we've clarified so many rules that were just not that clear before, that didn't make a lot of sense, or even that were ambiguous in practice. And we've clarified them. And I'm not going to go through all of the examples in depth, but even simple things like pointing out which rules can you customize in your circle on your team, and which ones are fundamental to making Holacracy work that you shouldn't change, right? That wasn't clear in the last version. It is now. There's a lot more clear about what you can do with policies and how policies work. And even something as simple as what I call the golden rule of Holacracy, which is the rule that says in Holacracy, when you fill a role, you can make any decision or change anything in the company to serve your role, as long as you don't violate a rule that we've captured from our governance. And the last version of the Constitution never said that. It doesn't say that directly. You have to infer that. You have to read lots of different pieces to kind of understand what authority you have. And the new version, it says it so clearly. Here's the authority you get when you fill a role. And here are the limits on your authority. And it's so direct and it's so clear, you can't miss it now. So those are just a few examples. And again, there's more I could say about them, but I'll leave it at that as a summary. So much is just clearer in the rules themselves. Things are less ambiguous, more clear, and things that weren't stated at all before, where the rules were just silent. Now we have something in there, so you have at least a default. Even if you want to change the rules yourself, that's fine. But you need a good default so everyone's on the same page. And there's so much more clear in this version. And you can imagine the tensions that led to that. It was just ambiguity and complexity. Things were more complex when they were ambiguous. And sometimes the ambiguous rules would lead to conflicts or just people calling meetings to talk about something instead of leading and driving forward fast because they have clear boundaries and clear rules. It's one of the things I think when people are new to self-management, they're sometimes surprised to hear how much I talk about rules. Isn't self-management all about freedom? And I don't see those two things as separable, right? If you don't know the limits, you don't know your freedom. If you don't know the boundaries, you don't know what freedom you have within the boundaries. So much about Holacracy is about clarifying boundaries so that you know the freedom you have within them. This is where a lot of companies fail when they try to get more empowered teams. They try to remove rules that are bureaucratic, which is good, but they don't replace them with anything. They just tell people, go, lead, be empowered. And that doesn't give you empowered teams. It gives you confused people because people know intuitively there's some limit on their power. And if you don't know the limits of your power, you're going to spend more time looking for what they are and checking them out, making sure you're okay, talking to the boss, talking to your team, instead of leading within clear rules, within clear limits. So a lot of the power of Holacracy is clarifying boundaries and rules so that we give people complete freedom within them. And version 5 does a better job of that. So it's kind of the second major thing I'll mention. The third, there are new rules for how we allocate resources, how we say allocate spending decisions, who can spend what, financial control. And I'm really pleased with this because in version 4.1 and before in Holacracy, the old version, we basically said the circle lead or the lead link of the team gets to decide all spending decisions, which was fine, but it didn't go as far as I think it could towards a more decentralized self-managed system. right? It's centralized that power in one person on a team who controlled all spending, and spending's pretty cross-cutting. It affects a lot of things, right? It's hard to be empowered in your role if you need to go get every spending decision approved by one person. And so we experimented with different approaches for many years, actually, and found one that ultimately works very well generically in most teams. And we built that into version 5. So there's a new way of getting financial spending decision or power to spend that is more decentralized now, where anyone has the authority to spend resources as long as they follow a process. And the process still allows the kind of financial control that companies need. We still need to make sure spending is wise, that it's not wasteful, that it's aligned with overall goals, right? That we're not spending too much. So there are still ways to get that control. In this process, as a circle lead, we used to call them lead links, we now call them circle leads. As a circle lead, I still feel like I have all the same control I used to when I controlled all spending. But more people have control now too. So again, the beautiful thing about self-management is it's not about taking power away from the managers. It's about raising power of everyone else in the system. And our new spending does that. Now more people have more power to spend wisely, but I still have the power to keep the team safe and to prevent bad spending. And so do other people as well. In fact, they can prevent my bad spending now in new ways. And it works. It works really well. So you can read the rules in the Constitution. I'm not going to go through all of them, but to give you a flavor, now anyone on a team can spend the team's budget or financial resources by just announcing to the whole team that you intend to spend a certain amount of money for a certain purpose. So I can say, for example, in my role of Holacracy spokesperson, I intend to spend $3,000 on a graphic designer to make our slides look better, for example. And then I have to wait enough time for people to consider that, ask clarifying questions, and react. And it's, you know, some judgment in there. I can use my judgment on how long that is, but I have to wait long enough for that to happen. And then after people ask questions and react, I have the freedom to use my judgment and go spend that money unless somebody has jumped in and escalated the spending for more consideration. So if everyone is just silent or just asks some questions, but doesn't escalate the spending, doesn't jump in and stop me, then I have the freedom to use my judgment and spend. But notice that I'm not asking for permission. I'm not asking anyone, can I spend? I'm using my empowered leadership and stating an intention. I'm saying, I've thought about it, and in my role of spokesperson, I intend to spend this money for this purpose. So if you don't think that's a good idea, ask me some questions, and if you need to, tell me that you want more consideration. You are escalating this spending. And if you escalate the spending, then it goes to the circle lead to jump in and make a decision, unless the circle defines a better process through its governance, which we actually did in my company. So we have a different process with a role with a few people involved in considering spending that gets escalated. So you can do that however you want. And in your governance, you can change this process however you want. So it's a default you can add to or change through governance. But at least now the default is not the kind of same top-down management hierarchy default that leaves people asking for permission instead of leading their role. The new default is much more empowering. So I really like it. This spending process is working so much better. In the old process, I would sometimes get people coming to me and asking permission to spend, and it drove me nuts. One time in my team, somebody came to me and asked me for permission to spend some money on something that sounded like a terrible idea to me. And I turned to her and I was surprised because she seemed smarter than that. And I said, "Do you really think that's a good idea?" And she looked at me and said, "No, I think it's a terrible idea, but somebody asked me to do it. So I thought I should defer it to you and see what you thought." And I can't tell you how much that hurt my Holacracy heart. Right? That's not what I want in my company or any company. I don't want somebody deferring their power further up a perceived hierarchy instead of owning and leading their own decision-making and judgment with transparency, right? That was the time where I realized we needed a new spending process. And that doesn't happen anymore, right? Now that person has to put their name to it. They have to say, I intend to spend this because I think it's a good idea for this purpose. And if I think it's a bad idea, I can still jump in, as can anyone, and escalate it to our escalated review process to get a little bit more discernment if I don't think it's a good idea or if anyone doesn't. So you can read the detailed rules in the Constitution, but I'm really pleased with that change. It's made a big impact in many organizations now. So that's number 3. Number 4, the fourth change I'll highlight is a completely new construct, which says in version 5, you can now define what we call a relational agreement. And this fills in a gap of something that wasn't really available in the prior version. You could work around it, but there was no really good way to do it. In version 4, you had governance, which would let you define expectations on roles, right? The way we do work together. That happens in governance, that works. But sometimes you need agreements of the people, not the roles, right? So for example, simple things that might have been covered in things like an employment contract, like you want somebody to show up at the store by 9 a.m. when you open, right? If you have a retail store doing Holacracy. There was actually no really good way to do that in version 4 because it's not really an accountability on a role. It's when someone will even be available to fill a role, which is an agreement of the person, not the role, right? Or another even more obvious example, maybe. What about you want people to engage in a conflict resolution process when there's some interpersonal conflict? That's not about roles. That's independent of what role someone's filling. You might want everyone on your team to have some basic agreements about how we're going to handle conflict among the people, right? So these kind of things, you could kind of hack it in the last version. There were ways to do it, but they weren't elegant. Holacracy previously was really about expectations on roles. And yet, any organization is going to need some basic expectations on humans, basic agreements we have with each other. And governance is not the appropriate place to define those. Because in governance, we're not giving people personal opinions. We're looking for arguments about the work and the roles. But when somebody's asking your personal agreement about how you're going to deal with your emotions, your charge, your conflict, we really need to ask your consent for that. Right? We really need you, the human, to show up and have a voice in that. And governance intentionally doesn't do that. It gives your roles a voice. So in version 5, we have a new construct called a relational agreement, which are agreements between humans, partner to partner, or sometimes a role to a partner when your role needs some human, some partner to make an agreement in order to fill roles well, but it's still not about the role, it's about the human. Like show up at the store by 9 a.m. if you're going to fill the retail clerk role, right? That's still an agreement of the human filling the role about when or how they're going to show up for the role. So version 5 now clarifies what are these? What are the constraints in them? There are things you can't use these for because they wouldn't be appropriate. And there are things you can use these for. Version 5 defines that, and it defines how do you put them in place? Well, you have to actually ask for somebody's agreement. And they get to decide whether to consent or not. And you can also make them part of the contract with the person. You can say, it's a condition of joining the organization. My company has this. As a condition of joining my company, everyone has to agree to the relational agreement that they will travel for our company retreats a few times a year. Right? And that's an agreement of the humans. And it's in our contract. You can't work at my company if you're not willing to agree to that. So there's some agreements that might be required to work there. And there are other agreements that people make totally consensually, and they can drop them at any time just by notifying whoever they agreed to with them, right? And it gives us a new way of making human-to-human agreements. So this is a whole new area that just, it opens space for more processes to be added to Holacracy that deal with relational issues or human-to-human issues, interpersonal issues, right? So you can now have a way to like attach different conflict resolution practices or cultural processes and have them connect into the overall operating system you're using more gracefully than you could before. So that's number 4, relational agreement. And for my 5th and final 5 of 5, my 5th major change, and this one I save for last because I think it's the one I'm most excited about. We have reorganized this constitution majorly for what we call modular adoption. So the tension that led to this was one of our biggest ones. We had so many people telling us Holacracy is hard to adopt. And this was one of the concerns that stopped some people, some companies, from adopting Holacracy, because the change felt like it was too big all at once. And they were right. It is. I mean, for some companies, it's a huge change. You're changing your entire power structure and adopting all of these new rules, a completely new organizational process, all at the same time, all up front. And that was a lot. And in the last version, it wasn't really possible to take an incremental approach to adopting only some rules at a time, because the rules were all kind of interwoven, right? They were all tangled together. You couldn't just take one without it connecting to all these others. And it didn't work. It would be kind of like, imagine trying to learn soccer by playing only one rule at a time, right? By adopting one rule. Like, imagine you only adopt the rule, you score a point if the ball goes in the goal, but no other rules. If you try to play that game, you probably don't have a fun game. You have a very strange game that people say, this is kind of stupid. And then people decide they don't like soccer, when really they just don't like playing by one rule of soccer that doesn't make any sense to play by without the other rules. And that's what we saw with Holacracy. People would try to do it. We'd tell them not to, but they'd try anyway. They'd try to just adopt one process of Holacracy or one rule. And it really didn't work well. And then they would say, we don't like Holacracy, and they really never tried Holacracy. And yet I understand why they would do that, because it was just too overwhelming to think of adopting all these rules all at once. And we've solved that tension, finally. In version 5, we have now organized the Constitution. We've reorganized the rules so that they're clustered, they're grouped into rules that you kind of have to adopt together, and they're separated from the other rules. So there are 5 articles in the Constitution, and they're meant so you can adopt any one of those articles independent of the others, in your own pace, in your own way. And you have to start with Article 1. Article 1 gives you the foundation. But all of the other articles you can adopt in any order, whenever you want. And you don't actually have to. You could just adopt some of them, and you'd have a more empowered management hierarchy, right? If you just adopt Article 1, even just one article, you're going to have a management hierarchy still, but one that gives you a framework for clarifying roles much better than most management hierarchies today. And if you adopt Article 1 plus 1 or 2 other articles, you're going to have a management hierarchy that's vastly more empowering, that forces managers to clarify and to not micromanage, but may still give them a lot of managerial power. You'll have a better management hierarchy. And if you adopt all 5 articles, you're now going to have a self-managed system. So I look at self-management not as a departure from management, but about a natural evolution of really good management. Self-management is not the lack of management. It's getting so good at management that everyone can do it, right? So, and this parallels now the Constitution. If you adopt one article or a few articles, you're getting better and better management discipline until you adopt all 5. And now you're at what I think of as the kind of next level, which is self-management. And And this gives companies that need a more incremental approach the ability to do that, right? They can start where they are and adopt one piece, learn those rules, get good at those rules, and have a more functioning company than they did before. And then when they're ready, they can adopt the next piece and get good at those rules, learn those rules, and still have a more functioning company than they did before, and continue on that journey until they've got the complete self-managed system, or until they've addressed all their tensions and they don't need to adopt anymore, and they stop there. So this addressed what I thought of as the largest, most valid complaint we got about adopting Holacracy. There were plenty of complaints that seemed like they were just misunderstandings that weren't real. But this one felt real to me. This one felt like, no, this is a constraint. This is hard to adopt. And I can tell you now, it's not necessarily hard to adopt anymore. You still are going to want the right support. I really recommend working with a coach like these guys organizing this at HappyWorks. And we have other coaches and all over the world now. And the reason I think we have coaches in business is it still helps when you're learning a new sport to have a coach who's played the game before and can help you. But at least now you're not trying to take on a massive change all at once if you're not ready for it. You can kind of roll out one piece at a time, right? And this has changed the game. I can tell you that I've already seen companies that had said no to Holacracy before. They're now coming back because of this change and the others as well, but this change largely, and saying, all right, well, we'll try adopting just one article now. It's easier to understand, it's more clear, and we can just do it a piece at a time. And then from there, they move on and adopt the rest. We have one client right now who came in saying, we definitely don't want to do Holacracy. We don't want self-management, but we want to get better and more empowering in our management hierarchy. So can you help us with that? And we said, sure, we'll adopt Article 1 of this Constitution and then roll out more if and when you want them. Well, it looks like they're going to be doing all of Holacracy. I suspect that that's the path they're on. They keep adding more modules, more articles, right? And so they were able to go from not even thinking they didn't want it. It wasn't even they weren't sure. They were pretty sure they didn't want self-management because they had ideas about what it was that were maybe flawed. And so we started where they are. We made them a better management hierarchy. Right. And then before long, they realized, oh, self-management isn't scary. It's actually just better management. Let's adopt more of it and more of it. And I think this is giving us an example of a company that's going to be a totally self-managed system that never would have even started on the journey if it wasn't for the modular adoption capacity.
Wow.
Yeah.
Brian.
All right. Let me stop there. That's my 5 big changes. And I'll hand it over to you for questions or wherever you want to go with it from here.
It's really a 5 out of 5 meeting. You know, I ignored the fact that you had 5 main points to share, and yeah, you did it. You made it. You did accomplish our promise. Brian, we'll turn ourselves towards the audience, and please, by all means, load the chat with your questions, if any. I could spot one relieved commentary upon the last item you've mentioned. You know, somebody was relieved by the fact that their Holacracy becomes accessible, progressive, gives some place to management by project as well, and this is obviously awesome. One question for you, Brian. Although you've mentioned that the fact that Holacracy 1 has walked the talk already, namely adopted B5. Any changes beyond this allocation of resources? You know, we've understood that you've lifted the barriers and you've mentioned that, but beyond the fact, any other changes you've noticed since adopting the V5 onto you?
Yeah, one of the observations I'll make is it actually seems to be harder to adopt for people that were really familiar with the prior rules, because for them it's a change, right? So we have people confused in my company still because they were so used to the old rules, and now sometimes they're different. So just a warning for those of you who are really familiar with the old rules, sometimes it's harder to change than it is to learn something fresh because there's unlearning required. So just one general caveat there. It's going to be easier for people from the beginning than it is for people that have to unlearn the last version. So we've seen that. We've
That would
also
be
seen the
another way.
rules working, like my spending comment, right? That's changed how people relate to spending in my company. And I see people using so much more of their own wisdom and judgment before making a spending intention. So that's been great. There's other rules I didn't mention that make it much easier for circles to kind of form and grow from a single role into a circle. And we've seen people using that, and we now have really small circles that probably wouldn't have been circles before, but it makes sense. It's a circle with 2 roles in it, and that's just fine. There's other rules that make that natural and easy in this version. There's even the language changes, like changing lead link to circle lead, and we now have role lead, which is somebody filling a role as a role lead, right? I love that. It sends a message that everybody leads, and you can kind of feel that. It makes the feeling of difference between lead link and everyone else, even though it wasn't intended to be a big difference, it still kind of felt like a difference in version 4 a lot. And now it's just everyone's a lead. There's role leads, and sometimes your role is a circle and you're a circle lead. And so there's a certain like cultural change I've noticed doing it.
Very much true.
There's lots of others as well. Just some examples.
You mentioned the fact it was sometimes difficult to shift from one version to another. Any tips and advice to give to an organization practicing 4.1 to jump into the V5?
Yeah, if you're already doing 4.1, I think it's pretty safe to just jump into V5 and learn as you go, right? And every now and then you're going to mess up, and that's okay. The rules are compatible enough that, you know, it's not going to be a huge problem for you. You're just going to find the same thing we did, where people are having to call each other on it and say, wait, I actually think that rule is different now. Here's how it works, which is fine. That's how you learn. So I'd say if you're already really familiar with version 4.1, just do it if you want to upgrade.
Do you have any stories to share, golden nuggets or difficulties you have been encountering as to implementing V5? Not you, but other organizations around you throughout the world?
So it's taking the coaches that do this some new learning and experimentation as well, because the modular thing is new. So we're learning, how do we support a modular adoption, right? And what we're finding is we need to be coaches, not just in Holacracy, but when they're adopting only part of Holacracy, some of what they're running is still management hierarchy. So we need to be fluid in coaching the Holacracy part when they're doing Holacracy and in the parts they've adopted, and helping them figure out how to meet needs in the old system without stepping on their new Holacracy pieces. So the challenge for coaches has certainly gone up a bit, but it's also a fun challenge, and I think we're able to add more value to the organization when we navigate that well. Other than that, there's not as many new challenges to adopting version 5 for the end company. There is for the coaches, but for the end company, it's just easier. I have yet to see any ways in which version 5 is harder to adopt than version 4 was. Right? Even when it comes to, I see the question in the chat about spending and legal requirements. The spending stuff is a default that is still constrainable in governance. So you can easily just put a policy in place to constrain around any financial control requirements that you have. That's simple to do. And that said, the defaults in version 5 still give enough controls that usually you don't have a problem with that. But yeah, generally, it seems like it's just easier to adopt.
You have been mentioning the fact that the role lead was a circle lead, and the role and circle are not as differentiated as they were previously. Yeah. Could you dive into that notion in depth?
Yeah,
more in depth, please.
Yeah, this is one I didn't talk about as much, but it's a big change. In version 4, there was a big difference between roles and circles to begin with. Right? Like if you had a role filled with multiple people, right, a multi-filled role, that worked very differently than if you had a circle that of course has multiple people in it. The role doesn't have governance meetings. If anyone in that multi-filled role wants a policy constraining the other people filling that role, they go to the broader circles governance, because circles are different than roles. But in version 5, those two concepts are conceptually merged. And that means in version 5, if you have a multi-filled role and somebody wants to govern that role, they call a circle meeting of that role, and just the other people that fill that role show up. And they don't have to break the role down into sub roles. They could just use that governance meeting to create one policy that just governs how anyone filling that role works, right? Or they could just break out one sub role while leaving all the rest of them filling the same role. So there's more fluid relationship now between what's a role and what's a circle, right? Another way to think about it, and this is the way it's defined, every role is a circle as well. It's just a matter of whether you're looking at it from inside or outside. So from outside, it looks like a role. You look at it from outside, it's a role. But zoom in and you're inside the role, and now you're in a circle. And you can call a governance meeting and propose policies or create other roles inside the circle. Zoom out again, and it's just a role. Right? So we've merged the rules. There's not a separate set of rules that apply to multi-filled roles and circles. Every role is simply a circle inside.
Is there an opportunity for each role lead to call for support within the role? Say, oh, I'm overwhelmed with the work, and I need some help. I need somebody to enter my role, and I can name it this person without referring to the circle lead. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is going with that last change I was talking about. This is one of the things you can do with it. So for example, real story, I fill a role in my company in one circle. And I fill a role, and I wanted a little help. I wanted a research assistant for that role. I needed to do some research. Research is not something I enjoy, so I wanted somebody to help me do some research for my role. In version 4, I would have had to go to the broader circles governance meeting and propose another role parallel to mine, research assistant, and then go to the circle lead and ask them to find someone to fill it. I don't have to do any of that anymore. In version 5, I simply say, hey, it's my role. Inside my role is a circle. I go into that circle. I'm so far the only member, and I create a sub role called research assistant. I don't need to go to the broader circles governance. I don't need to go to broader circle lead. I just go inside my own roles circle. I create my own sub role, research assistant. Now I'm the circle lead of my role, and there's a role inside research assistant. And now I go look for volunteers and say, I need some help. Who wants to fill my research assistant role inside this broader role of mine? And that's it. I'm the circle lead. I don't need to go anywhere else to do all of this. And as soon as they fill that, great. Now we have a little circle with just one role differentiated, research assistant, and the rest of it falling on me, filling the overall role, or circle lead, you could say now. So it's a smoother transition between a role and breaking down into a circle.
One could imagine you could even allocate resources, couldn't you?
Yep. If I had a budget in my role that I controlled, oh, good. Now we can, in fact, with the new spending rules, the person filling that little sub role can just tell me their intent to spend from my budget. And if I want to escalate that, I can.
Somebody asks you, thank you, Brian, does version 5 make it easier to implement Holacracy within part of the company, a team, a department?
But not the whole.
That comes from Jean-Baptiste.
I don't think there are any rules specifically that focus on making that easier, but I do think it is easier because it's just easier to adopt this version in the first place. So it's not because of specific rules that are making that simpler, but it's just so much easier to adopt. It's easier to read, it's easier to understand. You can go incrementally in your team or department and kind of gradually get other teams around you connected into what you're doing. So I think it's easier just because it's easier generally.
Is there, if not an ideal path, something that you would recommend?
When you do need to take it modular, you do start with Article 1. You can do the others in any order. The order that they're in the Constitution is a default order that you could consider. If I don't have any reason to do otherwise, I would go with that order, but I hold that very loosely, right? I want the tensions to drive it. So for example, if they really want more people involved in defining organizational structure, I might jump and adopt Article 5, which is governance, next. Article 1, then 5, because 5 gives us the governance process. If their meetings are really painful, I might go right to Article 3, tactical meetings, and just get that in right after Article 1. And sometimes you adopt not just one article at a time, but 2 at a time, right? So often it's Article 1, let's start there. Now let's adopt 2 and 3 together. because 2 defines rules for how we cooperate,
Right.
and 3 defines tactical meetings that use those rules. So they kind of naturally can go together if you want them to. And then you might adopt 4 and 5 together, right? So there's all different possibilities, and it really depends on the tensions at play in the local company, which one I would recommend.
So thank you ever so much once more for granting 1 hour of your precious time with us. And
thank you. Thank you for hosting. Thank you everyone for joining and your curiosity and openness to hearing more about what's new in this whole self-management world. Thank you.
Yes, by all means. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.